I'd like to introduce our special guest, Dr. Mark Jarvis. Dr. Jarvis received his doctoral degree in human development and family studies from the University of Texas at Austin, and he's now the department chair and an associate professor of family and human studies at Salt Lake Community College. He's taught a number of other colleges. He's taught at a number of other colleges and universities around the country, including Penn State, Western Washington University, University of Texas, Brigham Young University, Utah Valley State College, and now Utah Valley University. Wow, that's a really awesome list. He serves on the Utah Marriage Commission, is a past president of the Utah Council on Family Relations, and has hosted free marriage and relationship education workshops for couples. Mark is also a licensed attorney who practiced in the areas of criminal and family. Today, Dr. Jarvis's presentation is titled "The Secrets to Staying in Love." You can be prepared to learn some research-based strategies that can help you navigate relationship changes and be more intentional about your relationship through its lifespan. Dr. Jarvis wants to encourage you to ask questions and participate in the chat throughout the webinar. So the chat will be open for you to participate throughout. And we will still be doing the Q&A at the end, so you can also be prepared for questions then as well. This workshop is approved for 1 continuing education credit by the UAMFT. And in order to request that, you can fill out the survey that pops up at the end of this webinar, enter your information, and get a certificate for attending. So with that being said, I will turn the time to you, Dr. Jarvis. We're very excited to have you and very excited about this topic.
Thanks so much, Bill. Appreciate that. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have that invitation. And I'm glad that all of you are here. So I hope that we'll be covering a lot of content tonight. I hope that something from this is helpful to you. I'd encourage you to keep a pencil nearby and take notes in some way. For whatever ideas stand out to you. I recognize that we kind of have 2 audiences for these webinars, and it's the same when I teach courses at the college. We have some students who are taking the course because they're just interested in the personal application and what they can do for their own relationships in their own lives. And then we have other people who are there for more of a professional interest. They work with families and couples in some way, or they're planning to become counselors or therapists. And so they're wearing sometimes 2 hats, the personal hat and the professional hat. So I hope that you will listen for things that resonate with you and then give them a try in whichever of those hats you're wearing tonight. As Camilla mentioned, the chat will be live and everybody can see your chat messages there. And there's a separate window for question and answer. So the presentation itself will be about 40 to 45 minutes long, and in the last 15 or 20 minutes, I'll be taking questions from the group. So if you have questions that you want answered during that Q&A session, please put that in the Q&A window rather than the chat. I just worry sometimes that things scroll so quickly in the chat that I might not see your question. I want to make sure to get your question. One last piece of introduction, and it's Camilla gave you my sort of professional introduction. And my personal hat is that my wife and I have been married for 26 years. She's the nicest person I know. And we have 4 kiddos, 3 of whom are grown-ups, and 1 of whom is a senior in high school. So those folks might come into the presentation from time to time. I want to start with a story. A few years ago, my family and I were interested in watching these old school scary monster movies, and we checked out Frankenstein from 1931. Now, I'm one of those people who, as I'm watching something, watching some movie or watching TV, I'm interested in knowing who this actor is and what else they've been in, and then I end up Googling them and finding out all these different things about their life. And the person who plays Frankenstein's monster in this film is Boris Karloff, who he was an actor in the 1930s, well before my time, so I didn't know a whole lot about him other than he voiced how the Grinch Stole Christmas considerably later. as I was Googling Boris Karloff and learning a little bit about him and what he did, one of the things that surprised me was his marriages. So using your chat window without Googling it yourself, any guess as to how many times Boris Karloff was married? By the way, his name is William Henry Pratt. Boris Karloff is a stage name, but use your chat window and make a guess about the number of times you think he was married. I'm seeing 4, 6, 5, 5, 7, 1, 5, 3, 5, 3. I'm going to show you the information I found online about his marriages. He was first married to Grace Harding from 1910 to 1913, Olive de Wilton, 1916 to 1919, Montana Williams, 1920 to 1922, Helen Soule, 1924 to 28, Dorothy Stein, 1930 to 1946, and then finally Evelyn Helmore. I made this one a little bit lighter because these 5 marriages ended in divorce. This one ended with his death in 1969, and this marriage lasted a little over 20 years. So most of those marriages were fairly short. And this was an exception, and this was an exception. We'll be looking at that, the timing of divorce and marriage a little bit later in the presentation. But as I was thinking about Boris Karloff, it got me wondering about other Hollywood people who have been through a lot of marriages. And of course, somebody who came to mind was Elizabeth Taylor. Any guesses as to the number of times Liz Taylor was married? Again, throw it in the chat if you're interested in making a guess. I see 4, 7, 8, 6, 8, 10, 6, 7. I'll show you her information here. 1 year married to Conrad Hilton, Michael Wilding for 5 years, Mike Todd for 1 year here, but this didn't end in divorce, it ended in his death, so I've graded out a little bit different than the others. Eddie Fisher for about 5 years. Richard Burton, this was an interesting one because if you know her story, she was married to him twice. So for 10 years here, then they got divorced and then remarried the next year, and it lasted, if I remember right, a little less than a year before they were divorced again. John Warner for about 5 years, and Larry Fortensky for another 5 years. So 8 total, 7 husbands, 8 marriages, 7 divorces. Now, one of the things that will come up a little bit later, I want you to pay attention to, is the timing of these. How long did each of these last? And obviously, Boris Karloff, Liz Taylor, and anybody else in Hollywood, they're not like the rest of us, right? Most of us don't. Most of us will marry at one point, at some point in our lives. About a third to a half of those are expected to end in divorce. And many people who divorce will go on to a second marriage. But a third marriage is increasingly rare, a fourth marriage even more rare, a fifth marriage even more rare, and so on. There's something different about Hollywood folks and all the fish in the sea they have access to that most of us don't have access to. So most of our stories don't look anything like this, even if we experience divorce. I want you to take a moment to look at this couple. You don't know anything about their world, their life, their relationship, but based on just this snapshot of one moment of them, what stands out to you about their connection, their relationship? Use your chat window and make a note of what stands out to you about them. They seem very happy. They're both smiling and physically engaged with each other. Physical touch. She's not scared to touch him. They both look happy faces, really happy. Smile, they're touching, laughing. Someone leaves cups on the table. I hadn't noticed that one. Same level of joy, physically connected. Newlyweds. Julie says they're newlyweds. Happy, they seem happy and close. I want you to contrast that with this couple. And I'll ask you the same question in a minute. These are both pictures I got from the internet. I don't know these couples at all. This one clearly taken in a public place. This is some plaza. I don't know whether that's in Pittsburgh or Paris, but what stands out to you here, even without hearing anything that's going on between them or knowing anything else? Some of the things I'm seeing in the chat: closed off, closed body positions, with the crossed arms and crossed legs, bitterness, closed off, they're looking a very happy couple. They look bitter, closed off body language, upset and closed, disengaged to the point of potentially upset with each other, crossed legs and arms, protective, having a problem, sad, crossed legs and arms, could be a cold day, feel sorry for them, incredibly sad and public and deaf to each other, unhappy. Now, I'm kind of putting you in an unfair position, asking you to sort of comment on these people's relationships when we really know nothing about them. And frankly, I don't know anything more about them than you, just this photo that exists out there on the internet. When I talk about this with students or give a presentation in person setting, people will also notice the distance between them. So this couple here, where some people pointed out they're touching each other, they're comfortable touching each other, and this couple here where there's this physical distance between them that's potentially meaningful. And again, we don't know anything about their story. We don't know for this couple whether this was one moment, an unusual moment for their relationship, or if this was something that was characteristic of their relationship. And the same could be said of this previous couple. I don't know if this is a particularly happy moment, or if this was characteristic of these people's relationship as well. But when I was practicing law and working with family, working with individuals as they were navigating through divorce, I was volunteering some time at a legal clinic where we would give free help to people as they would come in. And so I would see individual after individual after individual who was sort of navigating this path, one of the most difficult paths that people experience in their life, and trying to assist as they navigated that. And I often reflected on what those experiences must look like in their lives without knowing a whole lot of the detail about it. And one of the things that often struck me is that almost every couple that ends up here started out here. Now, I'm sure that there are some exceptions to that, but the vast majority of couples who end up in this place started out here. Started out with that connection and excitement and excitement about the future, positivity, looking toward the future, and a willingness to tie the knot or to commit to each other for the foreseeable future. That's really sobering to me to think about the number of couples who are here and the percentage of them almost uniform that started here. Estimates put the average rate of divorce in the United States somewhere around 1 million couples per year. That comes from CDC data, and there are a couple of states that don't report those numbers, so we don't know for sure, but our best estimate of that is about 1 million couples per year here. So 1 million this year, 1 million more couples next year, 1 million more the year after that, 1 million more the year after that. That to me is very sobering stuff, and it's part of what I see as the core of my work, something that feels really vital to me, really important to me, and something that I want to make a difference with. So hopefully our conversation tonight will focus on that. Now, some of that's bad news, but there's good news that comes later. So how do people get from this stage over here to this stage over here? What is it that occurs, and what does the timing of that look like? Well, we'll touch on some of that research tonight. We'll look at what the timing is and some strategies for how you can navigate through these early times that in some ways are simple. We'll talk about some, part of why that's happening and how we can move forward in our relationships over time without ending up here. So I guess I'll have you use your chat again. How do people get from here on the left to here on the right? What is it that goes wrong? So I see a lot of answers coming in. Unmet expectations, lack of trust. They change over time and the relationship changes with it. So that sounds like Abby's saying that individuals change over time and the relationship happens with it. Tammy says life happens. So I'm guessing, Tammy, that you mean things external to the couple that are happening that then affect them. If I'm wrong about that, feel free to clarify in the chat. Communication, selfishness, lack of communication, not putting your spouse or partner first, lack of healthy communication skills and patterns, to not communicate about marriages or before marriage about goals, not filling each other's needs, lost connections, stress of family life, long work hours, lack of communication, lack of attention, lack of forgiveness, judgment, trust. They stop dating, social media. We still have answers coming in. There's a lot to that, right? That can feel, that could be very complicated. It can feel really overwhelming. How do you go about protecting yourself against all of that stuff? That's a pretty heavy lift. So we're going to take a look at some things that we know about what's going on, and we're going to start with the areas of conflict that many people experience. So at least part of what's going on is all of this. And you see some of these in the kinds of things that people mentioned. A number of people mentioned trust. Somebody mentioned expectations. These other issues we know are common areas of conflict as well. I'll actually be showing you some data about this in a few minutes. But all of these are things that commonly come up on the list. And we'll look at actually how common they are, and that that research is a little bit sobering as well. So let's start with these data. This comes from a study by Rich Miller, and he was looking at a clinical sample. So these are people that are going to therapy, and this research is about what we call in social sciences their presenting problems. So what is it that brought them to therapy? Now you see 6 columns of numbers here, and I don't want you to get caught up in the numbers. We're actually going to be looking over here at the left-hand column for a minute, but I want to just explain what you're looking at. So these 3 columns here are men's answers, and these 3 columns are women's answers. And they're divided by groups. These are the folks that have been married the shortest period of time, this column and this column. Then we've got people that have been married between 3 and 10 years. That's this column and this column. And then we've got folks that have been married 10 years or more. They're in this column and this column. And I think most or all of their participants were were in their 30s or younger. So they don't have, research about older couples was not a part of this process. But you can see over here those issues that came up on the previous slide. So in-laws, sex, leisure, kids, gender roles, values, religion, finances, communication, decision-making. These are the kinds of things that come up on the radar, and they're not uncommon. As we're looking at these numbers here, sometimes as high as 50, sometimes around 20%. That's 1 in 5 couples. Some of these issues down here, to put them in order of the most common at the top to the least common down here. So these are less common among these couples and more common up here. I see some questions coming into the chat, into the Q&A. We'll hold off on those for now and come back to those later. But I want you to pay attention to these here. Now, this sample was, I want to say 2003. So this was a largely or entirely heterosexual sample. And so these people are the partners of these people over here. So this column, if we compare over here, we can see some differences in what men are saying versus what women are saying. And Miller points out that there were some gender differences as they did their statistical analyses with these data. In the end, they found out essentially that across the board, when they take men as a group and women as a group and look at the kinds of things that they're saying is a problem in their relationship, there are 3 possibilities. Either men report something to be a problem more often than women, or women report it to be a problem more often than men, or there's no sex or gender difference, and men and women see these report the problems at the same rates. And what Miller reported here is that for each of these areas, either there were no gender differences or women on average reported those problems at a higher rate than men did. And that's about half and half among these different areas. I don't have in front of me which areas they specifically found in each of those two groups. But for none of these groups were the reports for men higher than the reports for women. So either no gender differences or the reports for women were a little higher than for men. We may come back to that a little later. Now, this is a clinical sample. And so sometimes as I'm interacting with students in the presentations, they're interested in numbers for non-clinical samples. So what does it look like for people that are not in therapy yet? And I want to make clear something about this presentation. This is a relationship education presentation. So really, this is not a place for providing intervention, counseling, therapy, anything like that. This is for prevention and for education purposes. If you are in a relationship where you're experiencing something that is more significant, more intense, then I would strongly encourage you to look into working with a couples counselor or therapist. And then these data would be even more relevant. If we look at a non-clinical sample, or one other thing about these data, these are not longitudinal data. So these couples here, these married 3 years, they're not the same people as the 3 to 10 years, and these two columns there, and those aren't the same people as those married 10 years or more. So we can't really look at the numbers in terms of these pattern here. We can't say that this is about half for men, and then it goes up even a little bit higher and then comes back down slightly lower than before. And we can't say for women it starts out even higher than men, peaks and then comes down, but only slightly there. So the change from one column to the next, we can't draw those conclusions based on cross-sectional data. This other study that I'm going to show you, this is from Statistically and Markman. Looks like Camilla has posted a quick poll. So she's trying to get a head count of the number of people joining the webinar. If you could answer that really quickly, that would be great, and then we'll move on. So Starosty and Markman's research was looking at a general sample, not a clinical sample, and they were interested in how things change over time. So these numbers along the left-hand side over here, these are percentages, the number of couples who report each of these issues being a problem. So for example, this blue line up here indicates that about 95% of the couples are reporting that they have ongoing problems or disagreements around money. And they did this longitudinal study over the first few years of marriage until these folks became parents, which was an average of, I want to say, about 3 years into the relationship. And then they're asking about the same issues then. And then, so they can track what's going on over the first few years of marriage, how people start out and what's happening a little bit later on. So in your chat, let's interact a little bit. Use your chat window. What stands out to you from looking at these numbers here? So Abby says money can be a consistent area of conflict. Yeah, you see that the numbers are high from the beginning and stay high throughout. Herbert says, can't see the full graph. Font too large in the presentation. Are other people having that problem, or are you able to see the full slide? It may be an issue with font size on your device rather than what's here, and the screen size on your device. I'm not sure. I'll wait to see. Looks like other people are saying they can see the full slide. So that may be something, Herbert, that may be something in terms of font size or screen size on the device that you're using. So let's take a look back at the content. So money is a consistent area of conflict. Yeah, starts high. In fact, it's #1 for these newlywed couples. And it stays high, even increases slightly by the 3 to 4 years into the marriage. And this #1, by the way, that's 95%. So 95% of couples, if you're a mathematician, if you're not a mathematician, here's what that means. Imagine yourself in a place with 20 couples, whether that's a restaurant or a church or in your neighborhood or whatever. For every 20 couples, Strassley and Markman are finding that 19 out of those 20 have ongoing disagreements about money. So money is a top issue for 19 out of 20 couples and doesn't decrease over time. Communication and sex issues increase with time. We'll come back to that in just a minute. Jealousy goes way down. So a lot of these stay fairly stable or decrease at sort of the rate that you see here. Jealousy is the biggest one that decreases really significantly. That's also the case with this other category, but that other category means everything that's not in one of these categories. So everything that fewer than roughly 35% of couples talked about as in their report, all of that together decreases over time. So the real significant one that decreases over time really is jealousy. And we have others that are increasing over time, particularly those here at the top of the graph. We'll come back to that in a minute. Sex, communication, children rise with time. Communication and sex seem to go hand in hand. Surprised that money issues are so high. Expected couples we thoroughly discussed before marriage. Not necessarily. And we'll come back to some of the issues that have to do with problems that don't go away over time. And so maybe part of that comes with couples having a difficult time talking about money ahead of time. And part of it comes potentially with what arises over time. So we'll come back to some of that. Sex becomes a greater issue over time. Communication, sex expectations, communication, honeymoon speakers over to relatives now or to this day. Sex and communication are potentially correlated with children and relatives are parallel. All right, so let me hit on a few of the things that I'm seeing there in the chat window and point out a couple of really significant patterns here. These are not divided by sex or gender, so this is their entire sample together. We're getting reports from both members of a particular couple. And as you see here, by far, the first place winner for newlyweds is money, followed then by communication, jealousy, which kind of disappears over time, relatives is significant, sex is significant, recreation is significant. And then over time, within those first few years of marriage, 3 of those become standouts, and it's these 3 right here. So basically, by 3 to 4 years into these relationships, there's a 3-way tie between the highest areas of conflict: money, communication, sex. Money, communication, and sex. And that 3-way tie is settling right there at about the 95% range. So again, like before, that means 19 out of every couples. So again, picture that group of 20 couples in the room. 19 of those 20 are having ongoing disagreements about money. 19 of those 20 are having ongoing disagreements about communication or frustrations with communication. And 19 out of those 20 are having ongoing disagreements about sex. And in all likelihood, that 19, there's overlap between those 3 areas. So for most of those couples, it's all 3 of those issues. And if you're lucky, maybe you've dodged a bullet on one of those issues or something like that. In addition, we also know what happens with more longitudinal research. So John Gottman was a researcher at the University of Washington. When he was doing research there, he followed couples at 5-year intervals. And so we know that these are the areas of conflict that many couples experience. And so we can give a couple a questionnaire essentially and ask them how often they disagree about these different topics, from rarely to nearly always, right? And what Gottman's research indicates is that if my wife and I are filling out this survey now, and then he follows up with us in 5 years and asks us, knowing what the 2 of us were arguing about before, he wants to know what the conflict areas are now. He says that the vast majority of those don't go away. So nearly 70% of the problems that couples report at one time are still on their conflict radar 5 years later. So again, almost 70% of the things that we're disagreeing about now are things that are here to stay. Some of your comments in the chat sort of reflected that, right? If we're struggling with, if in-laws is a frustration, those people don't go away. If one of the common struggles with sexual conflict is different desire. This person's more interested than this person is. This person can't necessarily just flip that switch off. This person can't flip that switch on. And so those kinds of issues are here to stay. Money issues. Many people have this belief that, oh, when I just finished school, I'm going to be making more money and our money issues are going to go away. Our research shows that's just not the case. Those problems tend to stay because it's really not about the dollar amount as much as it's about what our values are around money, how we spend relative to what we have, and so on. And we may come back to some of that a little bit. All right, so we know what couples are arguing about, and we know that most of that is not going away. And to add a new layer to this, our brains are not helping. I'm fascinated by some research by Andreas Bartels. He's a researcher in Europe. At the time of this research was at the Max Planck Institute in Germany. And he, in this BBC documentary, they follow these couples, including one couple who allows the documentary team to join them on their honeymoon in Venice. So the documentary team is there with them in Venice, and then when they come back from their honeymoon in Venice, they send them to Bartel's lab to do these brain scans using fMRI. And so Bartels has done research with couples who are in love over and over and over, and sees a consistent pattern in what's going on in the brains of people when they are in love. So this newlywed couple, or a couple that's about to get married, or a couple that's looking forward to marriage, or somebody that's relatively new at the process. Here's what Bartels finds. There are basically two differences in these brains compared to those people's brains before and after. The first one is that the reward centers of the brain are on overdrive. So these brains get particularly flooded with feel-good chemicals, dopamine, oxytocin, norepinephrine. The levels of all of those are high in this early stage of relationships. And critical thinking is on underdrive, for lack of a better word. Reward centers on overdrive, critical thinking on underdrive. So here I am with this new partner. Everything seems just so wonderful. Every interaction is rewarding, touch is incredible, and that's boosting what seemed like the good stuff about the relationship and potentially the future of the relationship. And critical thinking, the part of our brain that engages in judgments about people and trustworthiness and things like that, is decreased during this time. Any guess as to how long that time frame lasts, where the brain is sort of in this honeymoon phase? Use your chat window and make a guess. Six months, 3 years, 3 to 5 years, 2 years, 2 months, 1 year, 3 years, 1 year. Our long-term data show that this lasts a maximum of about 2 to 3 years. So we have this temporary period of elevated brain activity in reward centers, decreased brain activity in critical thinking, and that, I guess honeymoon brain is what I'll call it for lack of a better term, that tends to last about 2 or 3 years. Now that can be shorter than that for couples that are not going to make it. It's 2 to 3 years for the couples who are going to make it. So imagine your favorite couple that's been together for 9,000 years and has just cherished their marriage and is the kind of couple that you want to be when you're that age. 2 to 3 years for those guys, and shorter for the relationships that are not making. Now, Ted Houston is a researcher who was interested in following couples over the first few years of marriage and mapping how love changes over that time. Often I give these graphs to my students and I ask them to estimate what they think happens to wives' love over the first few years of marriage, what happens to husbands' love over the first few years of marriage. And often I see people's lines go like off the chart to the top. It starts out really high and goes even higher over the first few years of marriage. But maybe you can appreciate, having looked at the previous slide, that those changes, things that are changing, what's going on in the brain might affect this. And what Houston reports is that this is what happens to people's love over the first few years of marriage. And this can be experienced as a crisis for couples. In fact, Houston's original study just tracked these couples for the first 2 years of marriage. So this is their newlywed year. This is just after their first anniversary, just after their second anniversary. And then he came back in year 15 to see who was still together. And he found that these early patterns were significant predictors of who ended up staying together over time, and ultimately who was happy over time. So this decline here, particularly for women, is especially important in terms of what comes later. All right, so that shouldn't surprise you then. Now, knowing what you now know about the brain and seeing how love is changing in the first few years of marriage, take a look at this risk period. So these are years of marriage across the bottom and the percentage of couples divorcing across the top. This is CDC data. And so if you've ever heard someone say most divorces occur in the first 5 years of marriage, that's what we're looking at here. So year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, this is where the peak is occurring. Then there's a significant decline for the next 5 years till about year 10. There's some variation here, but the average is a quick decline here followed by a slower decline over there. So if a couple makes it through the first 5 years of marriage, they've sort of made it through the toughest part of marriage, at least on average. If they make it through the first 10 years, they've made it past this mountain, and the probability of divorce is then much lower. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean no couples divorce in year 15. We do have couples divorcing in year 15, and year 20, and year 25, and year 40. But the majority of those divorces are happening in this front-loaded risk period of time. So it leaves us with this perfect storm, and we'll spend the last few minutes, last 7 or 8 minutes today, talking about what we do about that. Our perfect storm is this. Love declines over those first few years. Brains are not helping with that process. They're disproportionately rosy colored early on, and then and unable to see areas that where critical thinking should be applying. And against that backdrop, conflict is normal and it's not going away. So what do we do about all of that? Well, a couple of things to consider. One thing to consider is that in some ways, just knowing this might be significantly helpful. So for example, if I back up here to this data, if I'm asking my students what they anticipate happening to their love for each other over the first few years of marriage, and they're starting with this really high on this love scale, and then increasing on that scale over time, maybe just knowing that this is normative makes a difference. So recognizing when this happens to you, that there's nothing out of the ordinary about this. Many couples experience this, most couples experience this, and couples can be perfectly happy and have a wonderful and fulfilling marriage despite this, if they play their cards right. And so hopefully we'll talk for a few minutes about how to play your cards right. Now, lots of different researchers have come up with typologies about how to look at love. And one of the most common of those is this two-type approach, where some couples have an experience that researchers are calling passionate love, and some couples are experiencing something more like what researchers would call companionate love. And it shouldn't surprise you at this point that this is connected to the things that we've been looking at so far. So what does the brain look like during this stage? What does the brain look like during this stage? And how long is it between this transitions to this? 2 to 3 years. So what that means in terms of early marriage and how we play our cards with early marriage is essentially that we have 2 to 3 years of this to prepare for this. And if we can't prepare for this in those first 2 to 3 years of marriage, then we have an elevated risk of divorce or of staying in a marriage but not being happy in that marriage, right? So if we look way back at the timing of Liz Taylor's marriages, I asked you to pay attention to that. Let's see if I can just hop back there quickly. It'll let me. Let's see. I can't see all of them from there. Those marriages were 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 6 years, 4 years, 3 years, over and over and over, churning through this and never transitioning to this. Now, Boris Karloff's story is a little bit differently. By marriage 4, I want to say, or maybe marriage 5, that one lasted 15 years. And the following one lasted a little over 20 years until his death. So in his case, it looked like there eventually was a transition from this kind of love to this kind of love. I'm not sure, at least the data don't show us that from Liz Taylor's relationship. So question is, how do you get from here to here? And if you can't navigate that shift, then you're looking at a future of a future in an unhappy relationship, or churning through one relationship after another, until you can figure out how to make that shift. I can't see my clock. I gotta check that. So a couple of recommendations that I want to throw out there regarding relationships, navigating that shift from the passionate stage to the companionate stage. And these suggestions really fall under two broad headings. One of them researchers refer to as relationship maintenance, and the other is conflict resolution. And I think more of your webinars have focused on conflict resolution. So we're probably not going to have time for all of these. So I might go a little quicker through some of that. So let's focus for a minute on the relationship maintenance part of this. Some research indicates that our own personality is associated with our happiness in relationships. So we can measure a whole lot of personality qualities. If you're familiar with the 5-factor model or the big 5 of personality, many of those qualities fall under these 5 categories. One of those is agreeableness. If you are a person who is high in this quality called agreeableness, you're somebody who's easy to get along with, you're easy to talk to, you're a sort of person who others would describe as patient, forgiving, flexible, and so on. That quality is related to people's ability to maintain happy relationships over time. In addition, we know that the positive stuff in relationships matters. So John Gottman, who is studying those couples over time, we talked about that 70% of your problems don't go away. That comes from his research. He finds that that the way that couples talk to each other is particularly critical. So he's watching how they're interacting now and using that data to predict who stays together and who's happy about that in the long run. And what he finds is that couples who are at least 5 times as much positive, 5 times as positive as they are negative, that 5-to-1 ratio is really critical for couples' ability to stay together and be happy. In other words, one way to think about that is that negativity in a relationship is heavier than positivity. You have to have 5 times as much of the good stuff to outweigh 1 of the negative things, 5 or more. And each of these is just significantly more powerful than these are individually. So load up on the positivity in a relationship. My wife is just amazing at this. We've been married, I think I mentioned we've been married 26 years. In that time, she has never once said anything intentionally unkind to me or about me, never. So 26 years, never anything intentionally unkind to me or about me. It just is not in her nature. She has plenty of opportunity to focus on the negative, the things I'm doing wrong, my shortcomings as a husband, and she just chooses not to focus on that stuff. She just intentionally focuses on the positive. Focusing heavily on the positive. Another area of relationship maintenance is something called intimacy. Now, intimacy within the culture here tends to be used interchangeably with sex, but that's a researcher, when researchers, the social scientists use the term intimacy, we're talking about closeness and connection. And sex is one type of intimacy, but it's certainly not the only type. And some of this research that we've been hinting at tonight suggests it's not even the most important type of relationship or type of intimacy of the time. A psychologist by the name of Robert Sternberg characterizes relationships in terms of these 3 elements. It's referred to as the triangle theory of love. And so Sternberg says in loving relationships, our loving relationships are made up of these three elements: passion, intimacy, and commitment. And the amount of each of those components or ingredients varies from one relationship to another. He has labels for all the different possible combinations of these. If you have a relationship that's just based on passion without these other pieces, what is that called, or what does that look like? Here, our purpose is to focus on the idea that most people are looking for all three of these together, and he calls that consummate love. So we're looking for the one, and by that we tend to mean a romantic relationship where this passion element is high, where this intimacy element is high, and where this commitment element is high. Commitment here also referred to as decision. It's the intentionality about staying in a relationship over time. And so we're looking for all three of those together. A fascinating research study by a researcher named Ronald Rogue at the University of Rochester. For copyright reasons, I can't show you this, but you could Google the headline that you see there and be taken to his page. Rogue was interested in helping couples through this early difficult time in the relationship, knowing that most divorces are happening early on. And in his study, he created randomly assigned couples to one of three groups. The first group was a control group that received no help or treatment. They were just there for comparison purposes. The second group was a treatment group that got a sort of standard couples workshop kind of approach. So the kinds of things that couples go through at a couple retreat. Often much of the information that is shared at webinars like this. And for the third couple, or the third group of couples, he assigned them to watch movies together, one movie a week for 5 weeks in a row. And over here, he's got this guide that couples that were given to couples, where they answer questions about the movie that they watched. And he reports finding that over the 3-year period of their study, this reduced the probability of divorce by half. It was just as powerful as couples doing the couple retreat kind of approach. And that's significant for a very low cost way to help couples navigate this sort of danger zone of the first few years of marriage. And let's see, so reduce the probability of divorce by half. And the reason I wanted to focus on this in terms of intimacy is that I can't show it here, again, for copyright reasons, but if you Google this and go to the website and open this guide here, you'll see that the questions that the couples are to answer after watching each of these movies is about what they're seeing in the characters in the movie and how it applies to them. So he's given a very specific list of movies there. These are not a couple that doesn't know each other getting together for their happily ever after by the end of the movie. That's a really common scenario in romantic movies. The list of movies that he uses are established couples, people that are already in established relationships and then experiencing challenges in those relationships and how they resolve them. So it gives an opportunity for viewers then to consider in an established relationship, what do those challenges look like? What do people do with that? And how does that apply to our relationship? If we look back at Sternberg, that doesn't have anything to do with this. None of his questions are about this element. All of the questions that he's focusing on are really about this. What does our connection look like? How close do we feel to each other? And about this issue. So his research indicates that these are powerful strategies for surviving the shift, so to speak. We'll talk about one more area and then turn to question and answers. And by the way, I think I've seen a couple questions come up in the chat. If you would move those to the question and answer place, then that would help me make sure that I'm not missing anything as I scroll to the chat. One last area to focus on here in terms of relationship maintenance is take a moment to answer this question. So use the chat if you're comfortable doing it. If it's your answer to that question is too private, then don't put that in the chat. But if you're comfortable in the chat, answer that question and put your answer there. If somebody really loved me, they would show it by what? So we've got some answers coming through here. Respecting boundaries, telling me they love me, understanding love language, we'll come back to that. Serving, action, so taking some kind of action, following through, showing love through actions, mirroring words, words of affirmation, listening to me, etc. So there are a number of people that do research about this concept. I'm going to focus on the way that this information is processed by some researchers from the University of Denver. They have what they call the PrEP approach, which stands for Prevention and Relationship Education. Relationship education program, I think. Forgive me if I've got that wrong. And they say that the way that people think about love, what some people would call a love style, what in fact they call a love style, and somebody in the chat mentions love language, is this idea that the way I communicate love, the way my wife communicates love, may or may not be the same. And in order for us to feel love within our relationship, I need to be able to recognize how she communicates love, and she needs to be able to recognize how I communicate love. And if we can't get on the same page about that in some way, then we can be in a long-term relationship where somebody loved us and we just didn't know it or didn't feel it. Another way that people label that concept is the idea of currency. So to use that metaphor, it's like if I'm trading British pounds and she's trading American dollars, and we don't have the right way to understand how to exchange the currency for the other person's currency, then we could spend a lifetime in a relationship where somebody genuinely cares about us and consistently feel like they don't care about us or they don't love us as much as we love them. So these categories, the service that you mentioned here falls into this category. They use being for just spending time together. So some people, love is communicated to them just by spending time together. Giving people things. If you're familiar with the idea of love languages, Chapman has almost the same categories, but he combines 4 and 5. So saying encouraging and uplifting and positive things to each other. Just talking about things, talking through your day, sharing information, bouncing ideas off of each other. And touch, both sexual and non-sexual touch, depending on the context, is an area of currency for one person or another. So one thing to consider is not only your answer to that question, but what your spouse or partner's answer to that question is. I'm a lot later than I thought, so we're going to have to, those were the relationship maintenance issues, and so we'll pause there for tonight. I'll take the questions that I'm seeing in the Q&A box, and just hope that something that we talked about tonight resonated with you, some new piece of information, some insights about maybe that's why we're experiencing what we're experiencing, and then some of these relationship maintenance ideas about what we can do with it. And what I hope that means for you is that when you or your clients or loved ones are at the point where you transition from that passionate phase to the companion phase, you're able to transition through that shift in a way that is ultimately lasting, in a way that's fulfilling in the long run and richly rewarding for you guys. All right, I'll take a moment to address as many of the questions in the question and answer as I can. Again, if you posted a question in the chat, if you could move it to the question and answer area, that would be helpful. Somebody asked, how do you navigate back from the unhappy, distant couple to the happy and close couple? Is there hope? Yeah, so a lot of this research that we've been talking about tonight, these relationship maintenance strategies, are areas that a person could engage in to rebuild those that connection. I'm thinking of Terry Orbach's work as well. I wonder if I can put something in the chat. So Terry Orbach, Google Terry Orbach. She's got a really great TED talk where she addresses that issue as well. And consider support options like therapy and counseling. So helping somebody rebuild the positive stuff that used to be there, really central question for many couples that are already past that transition phase. So Orbach, counseling and maintenance, relationship maintenance strategies. I think conflict resolution strategies absolutely critical as well. Like we talked about tonight, there are these common areas of conflict. Most of them are not going away over time. I think some of the other webinars focus on those issues. So I would encourage you to look through the archived webinars on the Stronger Marriage site and look at some of the content there as well. Alex asked, when was this study done? Alex, I'm not sure which study you're talking about. My apologies. What span of time asked specifically this the pandemic has altered many relationship patterns. Yeah, the pandemic is a fascinating issue because most of what we're talking about here is pre-pandemic research, and pandemic research is relatively new. So there are research studies coming out right now about the impact of the pandemic on couples' relationships, but we don't have really longitudinal long-term data about the impact of the pandemic. So some research indicates that the pandemic reduced the divorce rate somewhat, but could potentially increase some of the conflicts that couples are experiencing. What that looks like in the long run, we don't know yet, and we won't know yet till we have longitudinal research fleshing that out in the road. Fabiola asks, how do arranged marriages compare? Do they follow similar trends? We don't have a ton of research about them because there are cultural issues that conflate some of that. But some of the things that I've read about research in arranged marriages is that obviously they were not starting out with the passion element. We're starting out in many cases with a commitment element. If you think of Sternberg's triangle with passion, intimacy, and commitment. So starting out with the commitment element and then building intimacy and passion over time. And one of the things I read recently suggested that over time, arranged marriages are just as happy and stable as love-based marriages. So a really fascinating look into a very different approach to what the relationship is, but the fact that it can be just as rewarding and just as stable over time. Is there a book or article more in depth about a triangle theory of love? That would be Sternberg. McKaylee, I'm going to put my email in the chat in case I don't get to everybody's questions today. So Robert Sternberg is the person who initially proposed the triangle theory, and then others have written about the triangle theory since then. So look for Robert Sternberg, and you could probably even just Google Sternberg triangle theory and read other people's take on that, both clinicians' take and social scientists' take as well. Where do we find the movies you mentioned? That is here. So if you're talking about this, then Google what you see right there, and you'll find Ronald Rhodes' research. If you're talking about some other movie, then clarify that, and I'll try to answer that as well. Julie says, in the consummate love triangle, each of the three angles is 60 degrees. The research suggesting that if one area is less than 60, you can still be successful if another area is more than 60 degrees. Yeah, so this idea that Sternberg's point here is that they're not all equal, that we might be more heavy here than we are here, or more heavy here than we are here. The idea is that we're looking for high rates of all of those over time. But I don't know necessarily that that means that, well, certainly doesn't mean that those need to be exactly equal at all times. My parents, for example, had a relationship that I would not characterize as particularly close and warm. I watched them fight about trivial things for decades and just thought I never want to have a marriage like that. But they had this in spades. So they didn't seem to have much of this. They didn't seem to spend time together. They even had different areas of the house where they sort of hung out. They didn't seem to connect. I didn't see a lot of this. They had a lot of this. And then over time, ultimately, my dad was diagnosed with terminal prostate cancer. And suddenly things changed in really significant ways for them. I shouldn't say suddenly, but maybe some of those trivialities didn't matter so much anymore. And as his health declined, the focus was not on passion. That commitment had always been there, but there was significantly more intimacy in their last few years. And remember, by intimacy, we mean emotional connection, friendship and connection, than there was in many years leading up to that. So I saw them end at the end of his life with a much happier marriage, even though it did not have this element at all, and it was high in these other areas. Anne asks whether the studies that we're talking about here are inclusive of gay, trans, and LGBT couples and non-traditional marriages. Yeah, so many of the studies that we're looking here used a heterosexual sample, particularly the older studies that have more longitudinal data. But others have done data analysis with LGBTQ couples and found many of the same patterns. You might not see some of the same sex and gender patterns, but similar areas of conflict, similar hopes for the relationship and what relationship quality means, lots of similarities there. What are some of the most important relationship maintenance practices? I hope that we already covered that. So I would refer you back to some of the things that we've covered so far, and hopefully I can touch on these last two questions. These relationship trends read the same for non-heterosexual relationships, so we just touched on that. Or even non-monogamous relationships. I actually don't know about non-monogamous relationships. That's a fascinating question. I'd need to dig into that. Alex, if you want to email me at the email address I posted in there and see what I can find and get back to you, happy to do that. Does a satisfactory, long-lasting marriage increase with marrying later in age? Wow, that's there was a recent report. Okay, so short version. We know that the younger a couple is, the more likely that they are to divorce in terms of age at first marriage. So couples that are getting married in the teens, the risk is higher, and that risk goes down as couples increase, or as couples move toward mid-20s and late 20s, and then the probability actually increases again a little bit higher. There's a new research report from, I want to say, University of Virginia and some researchers at BYU, who found that couples marrying in the earlier part of that also had stable and satisfying marriages as well. So, so marrying later in age, the answer is sort of a qualified yes. Marrying too young appears to be problematic, but in early 20s that can work for many couples. And then sort of there appears to be this a sort of peak time around mid to late 20s where the overall risk appears to be lowest. So I would say early to mid late 20s are all areas that where a satisfactory long-term marriage is we've got as much of a shot as somebody else, assuming that we focus on these other things. All right, we're out of time for tonight. You have my email address. Please feel free to send me any additional questions that you'd like. I'm happy to answer those questions. And I want to wish you good luck. I hope something in this presentation resonates with you, and wish you luck as you transition and shift from the passionate stage of your relationships to the companion stage. Thank you so much, everybody. I'll turn the time back to Camilla.
Thank you. That was awesome. I love all of the research that you put into this, and like what you were able to like all the research-based information you were able to show. Super helpful and really fascinating. Okay, so really quick, I'll just mention the CEUs. I have seen a couple questions about CEUs. Fill out the survey that pops up when this webinar ends or when you exit out. It's one of the last questions, so just be aware of that, but it is in there. You can request it. You'll receive a certificate automatically after you fill out your information. And then anyone who wants a recording, I will be sending out a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. So everyone who's here today will get a direct link to the recording tomorrow at some point. And I will also send out Dr. Jarvis's email address with that email, just so everyone has it in case you don't get it in the chat today.
And it gets archived on the site, right, Camilla?
Yes. So not only will I be sending it out to everyone, but we do also archive it on our website. I actually think I saw a question about, will there be webinars about emotion management in the future? Yes, we don't have any currently planned, but we actually have some that we did a couple months ago, even weeks ago, on emotion management. So you'll get a link to the archived webinars page. You can go back and look. We have one on emotional boundaries in marriage. We have one on managing high conflict moments, things like that. So you're definitely encouraged to go back and look at past webinars as well. Thank you so much, Mark. This was awesome.
Thank you, Camille. Appreciate it.
See ya. Everyone have a great night.